How would you know if you had had an emotionally immature parent? A feeling of emotional loneliness. They're incredibly egocentric. Sooner or later, you will find that you're the one doing the listening. You're the one who is adjusting to making them feel better.
You talk about 4 types of emotionally mature parents.
The first is the emotional type. It's like being parented by a 3-year-old. Whatever they feel comes out. In families like that, the kids have to walk around on eggshells. Then we have the healing fantasy is that there's a good parent in there somewhere, and I just have to find the way to release that in them.
How do you know if you've been neglected as a child?
Lots of times people feel like they don't have anything to hang their hat on. They'll say, well, they never beat me. I always had food. And the person ends up feeling like I wanted too much.
The problem is with me, I'm too needy.
That's a classic sign of having been neglected. Also, the feeling that you're bothering people.
How can you avoid getting triggered by an emotionally mature parent?
To have a healthy relationship with an emotionally immature person, you have to.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's episode. We have an incredible guest joining us today. Her name is Dr. Lindsay Gibson. She's an author and clinical psychologist who has been a psychotherapist for over 30 years. Her New York Times bestseller, Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents, has sold over 1 million copies and has been translated into 37 languages. My therapist recommended her book 2 years ago, and I absolutely loved it. Just full of wisdom and super insightful. Dr. Gibson, thank you so much for taking the time and being here today.
Oh, thank you for having me, Francesca. I've really been looking forward to this.
Me too, so much. And I know it's going to be so insightful. How are you, first of all?
Good.
Yeah. Amazing. My first question for you is, what are some characteristics of emotionally mature people? What are some signs you had an emotionally mature parent?
Yeah. I'll start with the second one first. How would you know if you had had an emotionally immature parent, or what are the signs of someone who has had that kind of parenting? And the first thing that I would note is actually the first chapter in the book, and that is a feeling of emotional loneliness. Um, that feeling is so central to what people go through life with when they haven't had a sense of a deep emotional connection and communication with their parent. It's like everything can look okay on the outside. They can be very adjusted, they can have good relationships, they can be very successful in their work. It has nothing to do with that. It's that we are designed to have very deep, unique connections with the people who are closest to us. We need to be seen, we need to feel heard, and we need to feel like there's something between us that we can always go back to and show up for each other from that deep, deep place. And when you're emotionally immature, that kind of intimacy, that kind of emotional closeness is experienced as very threatening and very disorganizing inside. And so the emotionally immature person, when you go to them with your emotional needs or some kind of distress, they can hardly help but to pull back and to feel a little threatened by that. Okay. And so we feel that. We feel it when the other person doesn't come forward and doesn't make that connection with us when we have that need. And that feeling is emotional loneliness. Okay. So when I was starting to write the book, I was struggling to find a sort of a entry point to the subject. And I was thinking, what's the main thing? What will people resonate with the most? And then it came to me that it's the emotional loneliness. And then people feel like there's something the matter with them, that they have this sort of lonely feeling inside, even if they have a lot of friends, even if they're very successful. And there's nothing the matter with them. It's that they accurately registered as a child that they weren't getting like an essential nutrient that human beings need to have this foundational sense of security and a deep confidence in themselves. So that's how we would know. um, but the characteristics of emotionally immature people, I mean, the one that jumps out when you meet them is that they're incredibly egocentric. All roads lead back to them. And if it doesn't seem that way at first, because some emotionally immature people are very socially skilled, so they know enough to have a conversation where you ask the other person questions. They've learned some ways to get by. But sooner or later, you will find that you're the one doing the listening. You're the one who is kind of adjusting to making them feel better. And we do this involuntarily and automatically. So that egocentrism, where all roads lead back to them, is like the hallmark characteristic. Just like think of a 4-year-old. A 4-year-old has language. Uh, they can be loving and fun. But if you try to reason with them or get them to see your point of view, or have empathy for you, they can't do that. It will come back to what they're experiencing. So that's a big one. They also have low empathy. They have some empathy. It's not that they're psychopaths. They have some empathy when they're calm, when things are going their way. Then they can afford to have some sensitivity toward how you feel. But it's not something that you can ever rely on because it's completely dependent on how they're feeling that moment. So it's not a thing that you can count on. Um, as I mentioned before, they're very uh, nervous about emotional intimacy. They don't like to talk about feelings. In fact, if you're the child of a parent like this and you have an upsetting experience, you will have the feeling that you have somehow stepped in it, that you have sort of made everybody very uncomfortable, and that maybe you shouldn't have said that, or maybe you should just calm down and go away. So they often feel like they're bothering people or they're a nuisance. They feel like they're too much for people. But that's really because the emotionally immature parent can't handle it. Child learns that pattern of, I'm really upset, but if I go to someone and talk to them about it, it's gonna feel worse because I'm gonna upset them too. And then, I just mentioned one other characteristic. Some of the others will probably come out later as we talk. But the other one is that they don't self-reflect. In other words, if there's a problem in the relationship, something going wrong, it doesn't occur to them to think, "Yeah, I wonder if it was something I said," or, "Wow, I wonder if I did something that that they didn't like. Um, maybe I should ask them about that." That doesn't no, it doesn't go that way because they just don't do that thing where they can stand outside of themselves and look back on their own behavior objectively. To them, it's just like, whatever happened wasn't their fault. And so, from their standpoint, there is no need for them to self reflect. But you can imagine, what that does in a relationship between two adults,
Yeah.
uh, or between two countries, or whatever. So those are just a few of the highlights of the emotionally immature person, but they're the big ones.
And that's such an amazing description. And I'm so curious, why are they like this?
Yeah, that I'm curious about that too. I mean, I wish so many times, sitting with a client, that I had a time machine and I could go back and, find out what happened to that parent just based on how they treated their child who's now my patient. I mean, I wanna know that too. But it seems to me that they act like people who themselves were raised by people who were emotionally immature, that they didn't get their emotional needs met. They didn't have the kind of attentiveness from a parent in order for them to develop a strong sense of self. Like there wasn't someone helping them understand what it is that they're feeling or talking with them about, um, how they felt about something or how they see a situation. They act as though they had been raised, with that kind of, it's it can be overtly abusive or neglectful. I mean, that can happen. But sometimes you get the feeling that they were just not seen. They just never learned how to have a close, emotionally vibrant relationship with anyone. So I'm sure there are many routes to getting stuck in your psychological development.
Mm-hmm. And that's what it sometimes feels like. You're not talking to an adult, but you're talking to a 10-year-old,
Yeah.
in adult clothing, sort of thing.
Yeah.
I know
Yeah.
that in your book you talk about 4 types of emotionally mature parents. Could you please take us through those?
Yeah. Um, and I just want to mention that none of these categories are um, psychological diagnostic categories. I mean, you won't find them in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, but they're just what evolved in my own understanding of listening to different people describe different kinds of parenting that each one of them had had. They were all adding up to the same set of symptoms, like the emotional loneliness, the anxiety, the self-consciousness, the sense of being a nuisance, the compulsion to people please. They were showing all of that, but their parents in each of these individual cases might be quite different. Over time, though, they started to, in my mind, sort themselves into these 4 categories. So they're just what I've observed, and then people can, you know, see if it fits their experience. And they can also keep in mind that a parent may have more than one characteristic from the 4 types. But the first type is the probably what we would all think of as the emotionally immature parent, and this would be the emotional type. The emotional type is like being parented by a 3-year-old. Whatever they feel comes out. They don't think about the impact on other people of what happens when they just express their emotions. They don't understand how upsetting or overwhelming that might be to their own children. And they can't because they're so overwhelmed by their own emotions that they couldn't control it even if they wanted to. So lots of times you'll get people who, will, have an outburst of anger, or they'll yell, or they will, another thing might be they might become very, very depressed. But whatever form it takes, it's based on their emotion taking them over. So I could be volatile and angry. I could be in my bed depressed, but my emotion is running the show. And in families like that, the kids have to walk around on eggshells. Everything is happening in light of what that parent might do next. So it's like, don't do anything to upset dad. Dad will start yelling. Don't make mom cry. Don't tell mom that. You know what dad will do if he hears about that. So everybody revolves around the emotional person and tries to really function as a set of external uh, forces that help them to stay calm. Very stressful on the
Mm-hmm.
family. And then we might have another type of parent who I call the rejecting parent. And the rejecting parent is the one that makes you feel like they really didn't want to have children at all. They just don't seem invested. They don't seem interested. They, in fact, feel kind of annoyed with being interrupted by the child, which is how they see it. They don't like to give a lot. They like to concentrate on what they're interested in. And they're just kind of scary people because there's a sense that if you push them or intrude upon them too much, you're really going to get a big reaction from them. So people are a little bit afraid of them because of that rejecting quality that they have. Then we have the driven parent. And this parent looks like, like they could win a prize for being the most normal, the best parent, the most involved parent, because they're incredibly achievement oriented. So this driven parent, and lots of times they will have like multiple degrees. They will be involved in multiple groups and community activities, kind of thing. They're very, very driven to get things done, to achieve things. And they are also very driven for their children. That is, they'll put them in all kinds of activities, sports, and it looks like there's a high investment in the child, but it's more like the child as a project.
Mm.
Missing is that ability to pick up emotionally on what the child is feeling, or maybe just sit down on the bed next to the child, put your arm around them and say, "Honey, what's wrong?" And then listen, you know? Instead, the driven parent would be, "What what's the what happened? Tell me what happened, and who said that, and who did you go to, and why didn't you, and let's do this." Driven, driven, driven. So the child doesn't have a place where they can feel held safely when they have a problem, and then be cared for in the anxiety of their problem. Instead, they feel like they're being managed through the problem in a way that ends up feeling, again, very lonely. And then finally, uh, the fourth type is what I call the passive parent. And this type used to really puzzle me because I would think, are they emotionally immature? Because many times they were the favorite parent. They might be married to an emotional or a rejecting or a driven type. But these parents tend to be more laid back. They actually are more receptive to the children. They can be the fun parent, they can be the buddy parent. But what they can't do is they don't protect the child. They don't see themselves in a true adult parent role where they may have to make some sacrifices or risk an encounter in order to protect the well-being of their child. They just don't feel like that's their job. So in that way, they're kind of like big kids themselves. But of course, the child loves that parent the most usually because they can be nurturing, and they certainly can be fun, and they can be kind of benign. But it's sort of like benign neglect is still neglect. Um, Not helping your child when they're dealing with that other rejecting or emotional parent, I mean, that's emotional abandonment, you know? And lots of times the child just doesn't see that until much later in life when they look back and wonder, why didn't they step up? Or why did they just leave? Why did they leave me with this? While they went off with their new boyfriend or girlfriend and leave me to deal with this difficult person. And it's because they just don't see themselves as having that responsibility. And that's the egocentrism, and that's the immaturity.
Mm. That's so interesting. I think most people can identify with at least, one type of parenting. And I want to know, how do different children cope with this immature parenting?
Yeah, they can have many different reactions. Um, I talk at one point in my book about internalizers and externalizers as being two types of kids that come from these kinds of family relationships. And so the internalizing child is a child who just naturally is very sensitive, very perceptive. They like to learn, they're curious, they like to put things together in their minds. And so they approach problem situations by internalizing it, trying to learn about it, and they try to change themselves to deal with the situation better. The other type of child is the externalizer. And the externalizer is just reacting to whatever it is that they don't like or whatever it is that happens, which is a very maladaptive way to go through life because they project blame. Nothing is their fault. Everything is happening to them. So they never, they don't do that self-reflecting thing where they could possibly change some of their own behavior and have a better outcome in their life. That doesn't occur to them. It's always somebody else's fault. But it's a way of coping with an emotionally immature parent because it kind of keeps them from being crushed by feelings of not being worthy or not being loved. They brush it off and they blame it on somebody else. So you might respond either one of those ways depending on kind of your innate inner qualities. Because if you have that capacity to internalize, that works a lot better in life. And so you would probably turn to that if you had the ability to. And the other people go through life reacting and they have a trail of broken relationships. They may get in trouble with the law, but they never seem to learn uh, how to change themselves in order to have a better life.
I assume most people listening to this podcast are internalizers. They're the people looking for knowledge, self development books,
Yes,
podcasts, right?
absolutely. Yes,
Mm.
absolutely. Although it's interesting, I have had a number of people contact me who were on the other side, that they were the emotionally immature parent, and they wanted help with trying to understand that and work on that. I don't do that kind of work, but I thought it was interesting, and I strongly encourage them to find someone who would be able to work with them because they're on the cusp of developing more internalizing defenses and coping strategies. So, it's not that you are doomed to be either or. Sometimes internalizers need to put some blame someplace else once in a while, and the
Mm.
externalizers need to, take responsibility for their actions. But um, yeah, so people can change.
That's so interesting that they reach out. I think that's amazing.
Mhm.
I've also heard you talk about healing fantasies. Could you please tell me more about that?
Yeah, yeah. Oh my gosh, we all have those. And that's not that's not particular to emotionally immature parents, but it sure is common. So the healing fantasy is that there's a good parent in there somewhere. And I just have to find the way to release that in them by communicating with them in the right way, by treating them the right way, by reading the right books, by understanding, things deeply. And there's a feeling that this inner core of the parent could be unlocked through the right action of the adult child. And, it makes sense because emotional immaturity falls on a continuum. It's not like there are people who are all emotionally immature and then there are people that are all emotionally mature.
Mm.
There's a range. But if you have a predominance of these characteristics that I mentioned earlier, then yeah, there is sort of a shift point where if you have enough of those characteristics, you're going to be living your life pretty much as an emotionally immature person. But we have to remember that when they are not stressed or they are not faced with the emotional intimacy of a close relationship, then emotionally immature people can rise to the occasion lots of times. They can be sensible, they can be reasonable, they can listen. Not all the time. They have to be in that, you know, primo spot where everything is going okay.
Mm.
And then they may be able to, sit back and be receptive to what someone is saying to them. And, people who are willing to not make them feel threatened in any way, can have a better conversation with them for a time until there's a real conflict of interest, then it breaks down. But for the most part, um, that parent who is emotionally immature is only going to show these brief moments of connection when things are going well. So that's enough to keep the hope alive. This is the healing fantasy that one day they'll be able to stay in that state all the time and we'll be able to have an adult relationship together. And I mean, of course they have that wish and that fantasy. And then like I say, they probably have seen a better, more mature side of their parents at times. So it keeps that hope alive that they could do something to in effect make that parent more introspective, make that parent more empathic toward other people's feelings, get them to listen, get them to self-reflect. That's the hope. And I've had so many people say that, they had this wish or this fantasy that, something would happen. It might be a deathbed moment, but something would happen and the parent would realize what they had done or what they hadn't done, what they hadn't given, and that they would open up and apologize. And to me, that's like the most poignant uh, wish fulfillment, you know? It makes perfect sense to me that a person would want that. And I don't discourage people from trying to get it, but I do deal with them, frankly, in the aftermath about what they were hoping for and what they actually got from that parent. So after a while, the person has to come to a point where they realize that the cost of trying to make the healing fantasy happen is so exorbitant that it's just not worth the effort. Because the effort to keep trying to make that connection at that deep enough level is exhausting. There's nothing coming back usually. So, it's a grieving process when people realize that they've been caught up in a healing fantasy and that they have to let that go. Um, that can be a very sad time in therapy when people are realizing that. But I certainly would say to them that if their parent did change, uh, yes, of course, respond, go get it. Uh, but you'll know if that's happening because the parent will approach you with empathy, or the parent will show some kind of self-reflection, or the parent will start asking you about how you're doing. These are signs that there's something there to work with.
That's so interesting. That hope can be so dangerous in a way and painful. Um, but how do these healing fantasies affect adult relationships, maybe even romantic relationships?
Yeah, especially romantic relationships. Yeah, because we carry over that same mechanism of hope as a defense against reality.
Mm.
Nietzsche said, the philosopher said, that hope was like the last thing in Pandora's box when they opened the box and all the evils of the world, poured out, and poor Pandora has, released bad stuff into the world. And then she slams the cover shut, and the last thing that got caught in there was hope. And he saw it that people kept hoping that things were going to get better instead of seeing the reality and dealing with the reality and sort of saving themselves. So along that line of thinking, he was saying that, hope was sort of could be an evil at times. And hope, when it's flying in the face of reality or when it's denying an important reality, really does become counterproductive. For instance, in a relationship, if you were with an emotionally immature person, you might keep hoping that they will finally get it, and then there'll be like an assortment of conditions under which that's supposed to happen. Like, we'll go to therapy, he'll grow out of it, she'll finally realize, we'll have children and they'll mature, um, when he gets a better job, when she finally is able to go back to school. I mean, there are a million reasons why a person would hold that hope that an egocentric person who doesn't self-reflect is suddenly going to start caring about other people and asking themselves questions about their choices. And holding that hope alive long enough turns into a distortion of reality. So in therapy, we might ask the person, tell me about uh, how you see their potential for change. What have you noticed? What have they been able to do along these lines? Well, they bought me this really expensive gift, or he broke down and cried with me, or she said she was really sorry. It's like, great, okay. And then what happened? You know, because emotional maturity is an endurance sport. Okay, it's not a one-off thing where you do one grand gesture, or you have one unselfish moment. No, I mean, most people can rally to that at some point, but can you maintain your interest in other people's inner world, their inner experience, even when it conflicts with your own, because you naturally want to be fair and objective, and because you can't overlook the way that other people feel? So, in relationships, that healing fantasy is great if the person has the potential to benefit from your faith in them and your investment of time to give them some room to grow up. I mean, that's possible, right? But if you're doing that and the person continues to revert to very self-centered behavior or loss of emotional control, or they expect you to manage their self-esteem or their emotional stability for them, and they blame you for things, then we might wonder, is the healing fantasy uh, contributing to this person's growth? Or are you constricting yourself in order to pretend that this person is going to change? That's very different.
Hmm. That's so interesting. I can think of a few girlfriends of mine that have this healing fantasy, he'll change.
Yeah,
Yeah, and it's
yeah,
so sad because they never do, or, takes a really, really long time and a lot of work.
yeah, yeah. And also, you know, I don't like to be. I'm not one of the people that sort of come at it as don't even try because these people are so, so dyed in the wool, emotionally immature that you'd just be knocking yourself out for nothing. I never say that because I don't know. Maybe they'll have some kind of epiphany.
Mm.
Maybe something will kick in. Some latent humanity will light up inside them. I don't know that. So I would never prejudge a person from uh, trying to make the healing fantasy work. But I would be listening for signs that it was working. And I would be trying to help that person become more objective about whether their efforts were paying off. Yeah, because
Mm.
otherwise, they're sacrificing their own lives in the pursuit of trying to help someone change who really is doing, as far as they're concerned, they're pretty happy with the way things are going. And why shouldn't they be? Other people are managing their self-esteem for them, they're calming them down, they're making adjustments for their bad behavior. I mean, where's the motivation?
Mm. Absolutely. My next question is, how do you know if you've been neglected as a child?
A lot of people don't, you know?
Mm.
I mean, it's a good thing that various forms of abuse in the last 30, 40 years have come to the foreground and have been, have sort of seen the light of day. That's a wonderful thing. It's progress. And we don't want to minimize the importance of that because, abuse and trauma has such a profound effect on a person's life, not only from, having PTSD, but just your self-worth, your confidence, your willingness to take opportunity, to take an opportunity, to take a risk. I mean, all these things get plowed under by traumatic experiences. So when it comes to neglect, lots of times people feel like they don't have anything to hang their hat on. They they have a certain feeling, which I'll describe in a second, but they can't, they'll say, well, they never beat me. I always had food. I always had a roof over my head. They paid for my college. They helped me get a car. Um, when I was sick, they took really good care of me. And all of that is adding up to them like, I don't have a leg to stand on. I must have had good parents because we just checked every box under the good parent column, okay? But it's sort of like saying, that plant didn't get any water for 6 weeks, but it got plenty of sun, and it got plenty of uh, nutrients. We put fertilizer on it, and yet it's not doing well. So we don't understand what the problem is. Nobody tried to uproot it. Nobody mistreated the plant. No animals ate it. It's like, yeah, but it didn't get the water.
Mm.
The the essential main thing that a person or plant needs is that spirit of somebody's looking out for me. Somebody is giving me that connection at an emotional level. Someone is noticing what is happening to me in my inside world. The inside world is real. And if we don't have people who are aware of what's going on inside of us and who don't care to know, it feels empty. It feels lonely. And the person ends up feeling like it must have been them. Like I expected too much. They tried, they did the best they could, but somehow I wanted too much.
Mm. The problem is with me. I'm too needy instead
Yeah.
of the problems with them.
Yes. That's a classic sign of having been neglected. Also, the feeling that you're uh, interrupting or bothering people. Okay, that's very big for the neglect thing too, because it's a little bit like they 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 would let you go down, you know, 3 times, but they won't let you drown. But think about what it feels like to go down 3 times, you know, before somebody reaches in and pulls you out. It's torture. So, um, so neglect has all kinds of repercussions on your self-esteem, your sense of self-worth. It skews your expectations of relationships that you really shouldn't expect very much. You ought to be grateful for what you have. It's too easy for them to feel like they want too much, even when it's basic consideration and respect. Um, so the feelings of neglect are really, while they're not as dramatic and as easily identified as the abuse characteristics in a person's past, we really have to get at that. Uh, and the person has to be coaxed to not immediately dismiss what has happened to them, or maybe we should say what has not happened to them. Maybe they were crying on their bed and they heard their mother walk past the door, didn't check on them. Or, maybe they needed their parent to help them with something and they were just too busy. So these things can be kind of hard to ferret out in terms of the person's formative experiences, but they're there and and when you start to pick up on it, then you can go back in and say, you know, did that child have the right? Was it a healthy entitlement that they should expect that their mother would knock on the door or open the door and come in and see what was wrong? Is that a fair thing to expect from a parent? And the neglected child would say, well, I don't, I don't, well, they wouldn't have that response like, of course, okay, because they didn't get that. They're unsure of how much they can ask from other people. They're unsure what's fair to expect. Yeah, so it can be the neglect thing can be very hard to get at, and and it's important to get that concept of like the plant. The plant needs water. Children need interest from their parent for their internal emotional experiences. They're like equivalent. And if you don't get that, you're going to feel it because human beings are made psychologically and neurologically to benefit from that kind of interaction.
That's such an important
Yeah,
message.
it's not an option. We
Mm.
we suffer if we don't get it.
Mm. Absolutely. And what are role selves? I heard you talk about them in your book.
Yeah, the role self is a little bit like the healing fantasy, but it's self-applied. That's where the child of the emotionally immature parent figures out that they have to be a certain way in order to get the maximum amount of love and attention from their parent. So they learn how to develop this role self, which is like a persona or a mask that they wear that tends to get them the most attention and positive connection that is possible with that parent. So that's one understanding of what I mean by the role self. It's something that we try to put on and we try to live from as a way of getting more love, getting more attention, getting more connection. But the role self can also be who you have been taught to be by the parent. Because lots of times emotionally immature parents are very they're very exterior in their understanding of people. So they would have the uh belief like, well, if you're pretty or you're smart, then you couldn't possibly have any problems because they just don't look beneath the surface and they don't go into the internal world, which I'm sorry is a real thing. I mean, otherwise we wouldn't have psychotherapy. But what we want to understand is that the parent can have their own kinds of role selves. They may expect that child to be the responsible eldest child, or they may say, oh no, this child is the baby. This is sort of like the idealized little baby child that will never grow up and will never leave home. We're enmeshed and they're my little youngest baby. So you might have all these different roles that the parent wants and supports because it kind of makes them feel better. It has nothing to do with whether it's any good for the child, but they tend to look at family roles as sacrosanct. Like, um, you must do this or you must be this way because that is your family role. That's who I've decided you're going to be. I mean, like back in the Middle Ages, these were like culturally assigned things. Like was it like the oldest son inherited the land, and then the next son had to become a priest, and then the next person had to do this and that. All the way down to the daughter who stays at home and takes care of the parents when they're old. So it used to be actually culturally, like built into the society. But a lot of parents have that same kind of rigidity in how they view their children. So the role self, we all play role selves, okay, because it works in different situations. But it's whether or not you can come back to the true self.
And how can you do that? How can you reconnect to your true self?
Yeah, the true self is a real thing. I mean, it really is. And the way that we know about it is through what our energy does when we are interacting with certain people or certain situations. I talk about this a lot in my very first book, which came out way back in 2000, if you can believe that. That book was called Who You're Meant to Be. And it was 15 years before Adult Children of Emotionally Immature Parents came out. So I wasn't thinking about emotional immaturity back then. But going back and rereading it, it's like, oh my gosh, I was writing about this stuff back then. I just didn't have a term for it yet. But it's the idea that you would be sort of sacrificing uh, your true self, your true calling, your true interests out of guilt and loyalty to your family relationships. That people would not follow the things that would give them energy, give them more life, because they would feel like they were being bad or disloyal to their family if they did that. So, if we're trying to get in touch with our true self, we have to pay attention to what happens in our body. Our body, in a way, well, I don't want to say it's only the body, because there are these psychological experiences, this inner world that goes along with it too. But the body will register what is the true self. And if we tune into how we feel in our body, we will get a very definite read on what is good for us or not good for us. And we'll be able to tell that because we'll have a physical sensation. We'll get a pit in our stomach, we'll get a stiff neck. We will, develop any number of physical symptoms that show that we're stressed, or our energy will just drop. We won't feel like doing anything. We're like, listless, like, what's the matter with me? I'm just not interested in anything. It's like the start of depression. Okay. It all has to do with our energy level, because we are made to be connected with this true self part of us, the part that says, this is what you're interested in. This is what matters to you. This is where you want to go. This is what you don't like. This is what you want to get away from. We can feel that in our bodies if we pay attention to it and we think that it's worthy of being paid attention to. And that connection with the true self is essential for us to have good self-esteem, a healthy sense of entitlement, not narcissistic, not grandiose entitlement, but a healthy sense of entitlement. Like, I deserve as much as the next guy, you know? And so we want to be able to tune into what really matters for us, what's meaningful for us, what we want to pursue. And the accumulation of that knowledge of what we're drawn to and what we're repelled by is the true self. And you begin to be able to feel it. You begin to be able to relate from inside, from that true self core. And then you get your energy back. And then you're much more likely to be drawn to people who also have a true self that they're aware of.
That's fascinating and so important. And, with Christmas and family gatherings coming up soon, I think the next question is very seasonal. How can you avoid getting triggered by an emotionally mature parent?
Yeah. I think the goal is not to worry about whether you get triggered or not. There's a school of thought that nobody can make you feel anything. That was really popular about, I don't know how many years ago that was, but
Mm-hmm.
if someone would say, well, he makes me so angry, or he, makes me feel so bad about myself, and somebody would say, nobody can make you feel anything. And I'm like, yes, they can. Uh, because it's like, we're herd animals. We live in a pack. We live in a community. We're supposed to pick up on other people's feelings. We're supposed to react to other people. It's sort of like, like the wild deer that uh doesn't bother them that the rest of the herd is taken off and is running away from the wolf. They're not going to be swayed by that. No. That's bad survival. So we are made to pick up on stuff because we're extremely sensitive emotionally. So when we when we start to notice that somebody is saying something or doing something that makes us anxious, makes us feel self-conscious, makes us angry, whatever, um, we might call that being triggered because maybe the person hardly has to say 2 words before we're triggered. We know where this is going, right? We know what the rest of the sentence is going to be because we, have suffered under their rule for so long. So, yes, we might get triggered and we might go off very quickly in response to that. However, that's just information. We really shouldn't fault ourselves for reacting like that because it's very healthy. It's trying to tell us, get away from this, stop this, bring this to a close, get out of here. But sometimes that triggered response doesn't elicit a self-preserving response. For instance, if the parent wants to belittle you at the Thanksgiving table, or, they want to make some disrespectful remark about your choices, at Christmas or whatever, when you're thrown together with them, then you have the option to take some kind of action to protect yourself. You can speak up, you can withdraw, you can leave, you can tell them what your limits are. You can do any number of different things to sort of protect yourself and take care of yourself in the moment. So the triggering is supposed to lead you to some kind of self-protective or self-preserving action. Then it's not a problem to be triggered because it's just letting you know you don't need to sit here and listen to this because this is bad for you. You're going to feel terrible when you leave here, or you're going to be so enraged you're not going to be able to sleep tonight. So it's prompting you to do something to take care of yourself. So we don't want to have as the goal that we shouldn't get triggered or reactive to them. We do want to have in mind what we're going to do if one of these habitual situations comes up again, and plan for that. So it's not a constant surprise. Like, oh my God, they did it again. Like, yeah, of course they did it again. This is what they do. So to have some plans for what you're going to do, and it can be, it can be anything, but as long as you're taking some kind of action for your own self-preservation, that triggered feeling will dissipate, but only if you take some kind of action. Like maybe the parent does something that is, disrespectful or belittling, as I said. And for many reasons, you might decide not to have a showdown at the Thanksgiving table. But you might sit there and be preparing your conversation with your best friend as soon as dinner's over. Okay, that's self-preserving. That's, I'm planning to go and talk to the person who's going to understand what I'm going through and be able to, dissipate some of this anger. Then maybe, I don't know, maybe at Christmas I'll say, I'm willing to come home, but only if we don't talk about such and such. That was very unpleasant for me at Thanksgiving. Well, what are you talking about? I'm just telling you that if we can agree that we're not going to talk about this and you're not going to make comments like that, I'm happy to come home. But if not, let's just get it out in the open now that I won't be able to come under those conditions. So you can plan for the future, even if you can't do something in the moment. But we want to be able to use those triggers as ways to grow. they're telling us that we don't have to, or we shouldn't, be okay with being treated like that.
I love that change in perspective.
Yeah.
And I think, also what you said about managing your expectations as well and not expecting, healing fantasies, I think, come into place, but also not expecting your parents to be different. Like, you know what's going to happen. Don't expect anything more.
Mhm. Yeah, and as for instance, if you're doing your own self-growth work, whether it's reading or keeping a journal or being in therapy or being talking with your friends who are psychologically minded, whatever it is, if you're doing your own work like that, you can find ways of growing as a result of the bad behavior in the other, I'd say, you know, in quotes, but I'm sorry, sometimes it's pretty bad. um, you can grow by feeling your feelings, knowing how it's affecting your true self, and then figuring out how you're going to handle it more actively next time without beating yourself up about however you handled it this time, because we only do as well as we can do. But we can grow from these experiences of these triggering situations. It gives us an opportunity to finally put ourselves back in the center of our own life so that we become just as important as the other person, as the emotionally immature person, because the emotionally immature person would have it that they are the most important person in the relationship. And don't you forget it. So we just want to change that dynamic through some action on our own behalf.
Mm. What if you feel guilty because, maybe your parents went through a lot themselves or they sacrificed a lot for you?
Yeah. I I think we would have empathy for them, right? We would have maybe empathy, maybe admiration. We may be moved by the tragedy of their life. Uh, like I know one person whose parent was abandoned, as a toddler. And so that sort of always colored her perception of her parent. She felt very sorry for that parent. It's a tragic thing. I think that if you're a feeling human being, you might feel empathy. You might feel the tragedy of something like that. But when it goes the next step to feeling guilt, now we're in a whole different territory. Something something doesn't fit there. And when you think about it, you can see what it is, that there's nothing for you to feel guilty about for being yourself, for having needs, for communicating what you want or how you feel. There's no reasonable basis for guilt just because that is going to upset the parent. Yes, the parent had a difficult background. They may have had a tragic background, but that was not something that you were responsible for. Neither are you responsible for helping them get over that. You cannot do that for another person. I mean, we can help other people, we can be nice, we can have empathy, all that. And, if the person is able to benefit from that, they will. Okay. But if they're emotionally immature people, you can turn yourself inside out trying to make it up to them. And it's like water off a duck's back. I mean, it just doesn't sink in. Because, why? Because they're not doing the work internally the emotional work necessary to try to work through and get over a tragic trauma like that. They're not they're not taking care of themselves psychologically. They're demanding that you do it, and if you don't do it, you should feel guilty for abandoning them. But that's a non sequitur. How are you supposed to do that for them, for something that happened to them in their life way before they ever became a parent? So we have to find these places of disconnect, of logical disconnect. And I'm not a big cognitive therapist. I use those techniques like, wrenches and screwdrivers. It's not how I go about doing therapy. But every once in a while, you just have to get down to that granular level of, does this make sense to you that you would be feeling guilty for standing up for your boundaries or your needs because your mother had this awful experience in her life? And you sit with that with the person to
Mhm.
get them to wonder about it too, because they will have just accepted that, of course, they should feel responsible for their parents' unhappiness. And little children do that naturally anyway, because they think everything is their fault.
Mhm. So interesting. Something else I'm really curious about, and I want to know your perspective on this, is how is an adult relationship supposed to be different than the parent-child dynamic? And I mean with your parent. Is it fair to expect them to do more for you, for instance, to give you more, or does it become sort of like 50-50, on the same level, sort of like a friend?
Are you talking about what the relationship between the adult child and the parent should be
Yeah,
like in
yeah,
adulthood?
yeah,
Yeah,
exactly.
yeah. I mean, to me, it has to become like any other relationship that works. What I mean there is that you have you might have certain bonds. You might have a feeling of responsibility as a family member. There can be many factors that go in there. But essentially, if you're going to have a relationship with them, uh, then you have to be able to do what you would do in any other adult relationship, which is communicate your wishes, your needs. You would negotiate what worked for both parties. You would try to have empathy for them, but you certainly would expect empathy back for yourself. Um, you would respect the other person's boundaries. Maybe, if they didn't want to call you every week, you wouldn't have a hissy fit about, how they don't love you anymore. So these things have to be negotiated out as adult relationships between adults once the child gets to be grown up. Otherwise, what happens is that people will do these kind of pro forma appearances, like at the holidays or when at a wedding, or when they have to be with the parent, but they haven't really developed an adult relationship with them because they've never really told the parent what they would and would not stand for. It hasn't been negotiated out really. There's just a lot of assumptions flying around. And in order to have a good relationship with your adult child, you really have to see them as their own independent person who needs to educate you about the kind of relationship that they're willing to have. It's not all about the parent. And that's a hard one for a lot of parents, especially emotionally immature parents, because they just don't get it. To them, and they may have been raised this way themselves, it should be all about the parent. And the child serves that relationship in a way that makes the parent feel loved. But that won't work if you're really trying to have an adult relationship with anybody, let alone your parent.
Is it possible to have a healthy relationship with a parent that's emotionally mature?
I think that I think that it's hard because the emotionally immature parent has that egocentrism, that lack of self-reflection, the lack of empathy. These are all things that don't work well in any kind of relationship. Okay. Um, to have a healthy relationship with an emotionally immature person, I think that you have to be willing to be very active and very honest with yourself. That's the first thing. You can be honest with them, but if you're not straight in your own mind that you really don't have an obligation to call every other day or to let them come visit you whenever they want or whatever it is. If you don't have that, um, if you don't feel that you have the right to set some limits, you got to work that out with yourself first. And then you can set the boundaries with the parent. But, as far as it being healthy in the sense, I always think of healthy relationships as being mutual, as being back and forth, as being about not only communication, but sensitivity to each other.
Mm.
That ability to kind of guess what the other person is feeling or needing, not to read their mind, but just to check out, to be sensitive to their inner world. And that's something that emotionally immature people have a really hard time doing. So it makes it hard, but you can make the relationship healthy for yourself if you make it a goal that you're going to, be taking care of yourself, and not just living to make sure that they don't get upset.
Those are some amazing tips. Um, where does your critical inner voice come from, and how can you get rid of it?
Yeah. Well, the critical inner voice, I don't know if you're familiar with parts work.
Mm,
Richard Schwartz, Internal Family Systems.
yeah.
He's got the best organized therapy system, but he works with these different parts. And it's not original to him. I mean, this goes way back. But the critical inner voice is a learned behavior that at some point in your life took care of you and protected you. So we have to honor that. We have to be appreciative that we had a part of us that was able to guide us. Okay, it's through criticism and fear, but nevertheless, it guided us. It helped us to behave in ways that minimized punishment and got us, the most connection that we could possibly have in that relationship. So when you're working with the critical inner voice, you want to, first of all, look back and see what service it provided you as a child. Why was that a good idea to tell yourself that, you should be hammered for your mistakes, or that, you are a person who just, keeps making mistakes and doesn't have any worth. I mean, why would it do that? Well, it did that because it was convinced that was the best way to have a good relationship with the parent. So it's going to keep on doing that because it's stuck back in 1960, 1970, 1950. It lives there. It never grew up, that critical voice. So it's going to keep on doing that until you go in there and understand what its mission was and establish some kind of communication with it so that you can begin to help it let go of that mission, of keeping you a member in good standing in your family, for instance. The inner voice is it's an internalization of what we learned about how to get along with our parents. But when you start to feel any kind of terrible shame or embarrassment or severe guilt, I mean, these things are all signs that some protective part of you is trying to keep you from getting in some kind of hot water with your original parent. And I think we have to have sympathy for that part. That's what it thinks we have to do. Um, and then we can begin, once we set up that dialogue with that part, we can begin to try to find some other ways of learning to handle mistakes, for instance, than by beating ourselves up. We might say, okay, well, so we're going to beat ourselves up for, I don't know, like 30 seconds. And then we're going to figure out what we do next. Because instead of the person taking action, using their energy that way towards solving the problem, they're using that energy to beat themselves up. So you can give yourself 30 seconds to beat yourself up if you really want to. But then it needs to become a habit in your mind of saying, okay, I gave into it. I felt it, right? Now, what can I do? So you begin to take some steps to make the situation better.
Mm. Can it also be sort of like your parents' voice? That if, for instance, your parents were critical, can that become your internal dialogue as well?
Absolutely. But the tricky thing is that it never appears to you in their voice.
Yeah, would be easier if it was just your mom talking and you'd be
Shut up, Dad, leave me alone.
like, shut up, mom.
Yeah, that would be easy, wouldn't it?
Mm.
Uh, but no, it comes to us in our own voice. It comes to us in our thinking voice. And so it's like we let the robber into the house. I mean, we just accept that it must be speaking the truth. It's talking out of my mind with my voice. But you're right, it's not. It's picking up something from the parent. Sometimes it is the literal words that the parent has used. I mean, I've had people who, have talked about or another hurting themselves out of a feeling and a memory that they were hurt this way as a child. So that's pretty explicit, a pretty explicit connection. But lots of times there isn't a word for word copying of what the parent said exactly. It's whatever will give you the same feeling now as what the parent gave you when you were growing up. So if the point is that you would feel, like a bad, selfish person because you're not putting other people first, okay, it'll tell you whatever it takes to get you in that position. Like, oh, I should be more self-sacrificing. I should think of others more. Oh, I'm so selfish. I'm so bad. Okay, it doesn't have to be exact words from your parents. It just has to give you the same feeling.
Mm. Fascinating. So we've talked a lot about emotional immaturity. Can we talk a little bit about emotional maturity, and particularly for someone who's dating? How can you identify emotionally mature people when dating?
Yeah. Well, this is hard because if you've grown up with emotionally immature parents, and they've disconnected you from your true self because they've not been interested in it. So you lost interest in your own self. It can be very hard to get that back when you suddenly need to start making your own decisions in relationships. So we have to understand that we may be taken in by people who, really aren't as nice as they seem, because we maybe aren't really good judges of character, having grown up with emotionally immature people. So we give people too many chances, we excuse bad behavior, we overlook rudeness, we, do whatever we're going to do with it. But what we want to remember is that when the person is showing you their behaviors, they are, I can't remember who it was that said this. I don't know if it was Toni Morrison or Maya Angelou, but I know Oprah quoted them, but she said, when somebody is showing you who they are, believe them.
Mm.
Yeah. So, but we tend, healing fantasies and all that, we tend to believe that maybe we misunderstood something or will overlook something. So that's one reason why, for people that have grown up with emotionally immature parents, it's a really good idea to date for a long time.
Mm.
Uh, because people who are kind of putting on an act, or they're stretching themselves to appear more emotionally mature than they really are, uh, they will get tired over time. They certainly will get tired of doing that, and they'll begin to revert back to their more egocentric behavior if that's where they're at. They won't show as much empathy. They'll just shrink back to that more emotionally immature personality. So, good idea to really take your time seeing how they do over the long haul. But emotionally mature people are interested in other people. It won't be all about them. They'll ask you questions too. They'll show curiosity, not only about your life, but about how you feel about something or what you thought about something. They have a interest in the inside of you. To me, that's a huge giveaway, because the
Mm.
emotionally immature person has like zero interest in what's going on
Mm.
inside you. Okay. They also tend to be people that you can feel very comfortable around. You don't feel like you have to put on an act. You feel like you can just be yourself, because the emotionally mature person has a solid sense of self, and they will tend to act in ways that make you feel like it's safe to be yourself. Okay. Lots of times they have a good sense of humor. They don't have to be, funny all the time, but they just have a sense of perspective about life. And so, they can have a sense of humor that makes things, easier. Uh, they can be flexible. Everything doesn't have to go their way all the time. And there is a warmth about them. And that it's that, I always think about it, it's like it's in the eyes. And that's like useless advice, because, everybody has warm eyes when they're dating, but it's in the eyes, in the sense that you feel seen. You feel like they're really curious and interested in what's going on inside you, and they look at you in that way. And you find yourself telling them things that you had not intended to tell them. You're surprised at yourself. But the reason that you're telling them is that you feel that connection, with an emotionally mature person. They're not afraid to go there. They're not freaking out because it's getting too emotionally intimate. They like that kind of closeness, and
Mm.
they make you feel comfortable with that kind of closeness.
I love that. I always wondered why, with certain people, I tend to open up, and
Yeah.
tell them things that I would never say.
Absolutely.
That's
Yeah.
fascinating.
Yeah. And then you find yourself saying, I've never told anybody that before. I can't
Yeah.
believe I'm telling you this. Yeah, it's because we have the ability to discern when someone is emotionally safe, that they're going to accept us, even if we reveal something deep about ourselves. We
Mhm.
really have that ability. I mean, I just think it's so fantastic that human beings are like that. It's really our strength. I mean, that's how we got to where we are, is that kind of connectedness, not our aggression or our willpower or ambition. It's our ability to be there for each other. We became, like this this big organism that could take care of all the different parts of itself and move forward, and I think emotionally mature people make you feel a part of that, and we can sense it.
That is such a beautiful ending to our discussion, to our conversation. Thank you so much. It was
Uh,
so interesting and insightful. And I know it's going to be really valuable to our listeners as well. So thank you so much.
oh, thank you so much for having me. It's been a pure delight today. Thanks.
Thank you so much.